Today, what we wanted to do is really just start more of a conversation around, like, if you're new to the Power Platform, if you've never used it before, what should you be thinking about, obviously, as you go through this new adventure to use basically a very powerful low code, no code type development environment? It's something that's becoming even bigger now, obviously, with this AI enablement that we start to see everywhere inside of our market. So today is going to be a really fun day to kind of convey a lot of the learnings I have had personally as I've gone through this adventure, to give some background and some experience, obviously, on how you should probably be tackling these processes. And hopefully, as a community here, as people start to join and introduce themselves and say hello in the background here, we can actually have some more conversation and maybe some lessons learned that other people have had that they'd be willing to share on stream here as we go through this. So, like I said, today's going to be kind of an action-packed day, which is why I wanted to start it off right away at 11. But let's start digging into this a little bit more and have some conversation on it. So just to do some housekeeping at the beginning, if you've never been to a Stoneridge Confab, I know many of you have been, but if you haven't, really this is a forum for us to have a really great conversation and really show technology and how we can use technology to really address the business system requirements that most organizations have. It's not about selling. It's not about the perfect demo. As many of you know, I'll say if it's not a demo until something's broken, and we like to break a lot of things on Confab here. So the point really today is really around the Power Platform, obviously. And so just so everyone knows, if you have questions, we're monitoring chat right now. So we've got chat on YouTube, LinkedIn, and also on Twitch if you're using that platform. So feel free to introduce yourself, say hi, put a comment in there, have questions. Free consulting. We'd be more than happy to answer any of the questions that you have as we go through that. So Rob, appreciate you saying there as well. Let's have more fun with this. Let's go ahead and jump in right away here. And while I'm doing that, what I do want to check out is if I can actually, there we go, get that kind of enabled so that we don't have the overlay issue that we've been having. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and flip over to my screen so we can take a look at it. And we're basically going to go through kind of a high-level conversation that we've had to really dive more into really the Power Apps-based capabilities of the Power Platform. So we're going to do some framing because I don't know where everyone is at in this adventure, but I'm going to hope at the end of this that you're not going to be afraid. You're going to know exactly what you should be doing. And hopefully we can get rid of a lot of the different types of stereotypes / assumptions that are in the Power Platform. Because, like I said, it's not something that fits everything, but it does a lot of things. And I want you to know where a lot of those things are as we go through this process. So with that, let me go ahead and flip over to my screen. And let's jump in. So developing in the Power Platform. I figured a power plant was a fantastic opportunity to show that off as part of this. So I guess at a high level, what I want to start with is really what is the Power Platform? And there's a lot of marketing messages that are out there, right? That comes to the Power Platform on what it can do, what it can't do, what it's designed around, so on and so forth. But really at a high level, it's basically a set of tools that we as partners and you as customers may use then to basically create business system applications, from no code to low code based concepts being incorporated into it, along with different types of perspectives in a business system, such as the reporting perspective or the data entry perspective or the automation perspective. All of those are handled then within the Power Platform with a database engine as well that you can use, but don't have to in some situations, to be able to organize your data and interact with it. The key marketing message that you always hear from Microsoft is this analyze, act, and automate. And now with AI, we have assist as part of it as well. So that's really the foundational aspect of the Power Platform. I like to imagine it as kind of that next step in the evolution really of a development platform combined with a low code, no code language. Some people will call it a fifth generation language, for example. The net a result of it, though, is that it's allowing businesses to focus on building applications faster so that their end users can then input the data and then react off of it as part of those business system requirements. The other aspect of this, because it is a low code, no code type of design around the Power Platform, it's really designed to basically involve more users in those conversations. A lot of people call this the citizen developer perspective or the democratization of data and capabilities. I guess the key thing here is that it allows for more people to get involved in the conversation, to be able to create and address needs. Because one of the key factors that we have inside of business systems that's a key limitation in our market and around technology itself really is the number of people that can actually make these changes that can be impactful inside of a business. We want to expand that so that other people can be in this conversation to be able to actually develop better quality solutions, as you can imagine. And then finally, like I said before, we're starting to get more into the evolution of basically formula-based languages, for example, with PowerFX, to basically drive some of the business logic needs that you typically need without having to learn a more complex language like C Sharp or C++ or C for that matter. So it's a really good balance to be able to basically take some of these concepts and then bring them to market quickly, so that way you can basically develop what's needed for your end users without worrying about a lot of the plumbing. And if you've been a true developer for your entire life, you probably understand this, because if you were doing, for example, MFC development back in the day, my gosh, I will tell you, trying to make a window pop up or a multiple document interface, MDI type window, was a huge task. It was a lot of code, and the code never really made sense in a lot of ways for many people. So this is really expanding, obviously, what we can access then and what we can do, obviously, very quickly inside of our business environments. Now, the Power Platform obviously has many different components that are in it, and I took this slide because it's a little bit more current. Please note that there have been name changes, obviously, as we've introduced, obviously, some of the AI capabilities. So, for example, when we talk about the Power Platform, we talk about Analyze, which is Power BI. We talked about Automate, which is Power Automate, Act, which is Power Apps, right, or Power Pages for that matter as well. And then AI-centric capabilities, which is more of then that assist, right, with the AI builder-based capabilities. And even then with the Power Virtual Agents, which has been rebranded as Microsoft Copilot Studio, obviously. So these are some basic concepts, obviously, that you use then in conjunction to be able to build applications inside of your environment. And I want to just be cautious with it. I know I'm overgeneralizing when I say applications. These are business systems, right? So you can use Power BI, for example, without using Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, Power Pages, so on and so forth, right? To be able to do a lot of your reporting, which is what a lot of organizations do. But combining these together really gives you what I would say a very strong capability set then in order to really address really the common needs that you have inside of an application environment. Now, why should you use it for development, right? So let's start there right away. And I'm going to try to approach this in a non-sales slash marketing manner with it, more from the focus, obviously, of I've used it, I see where it goes and what it can do, and it's pretty cool if it's used in the right scenarios. And cool, to me, always means it melds the process, the people, and the technology in a budget fashion for an organization that helps them win, which is obviously our mission statement at Stoneridge. So obviously it allows us to build business systems very rapidly. So when we think about low code, no code, the intent around that is to make it so that as a user, right, as an end user, and we'll call it citizen developer, but really that citizen developer comes from an end user community typically. You can rapidly, for example, create a screen. You can drop controls onto it or text boxes and labels. You can put colors behind it. You can put your data in a grid and you can interact with it, right? So it really allows for you to rapidly build these types of business systems. I know some of you don't like this comparison, but I like to compare it to Light Switch, which used Silverlight back in the day. If you ever knew about Light Switch, it was a development platform that Microsoft made that allowed you basically to build applications very quickly without worrying about the underlying plumbing inside of it. So this is a continuation of concept, obviously, on the Power Platform, where it allows us to really rapidly create those applications. We can absolutely, for number one, the resources. So an example would be like, let's say you have 5 true developers in your organization and you have some people that are really technical, but they're not developers. Well, those types of people or those types of roles can actually tackle now some of the creation of these particular applications. So if you think about the Power Platform, not only does it allow you to rapidly build it, but it allows you to actually have more resources that you can use or leverage to create these applications. It provides for a very highly scalable database architecture with Dataverse, along with predefined table formats that are included in the common data model. And this is really convenient because if you think about it, if you are going from one organization to another organization and you want to build your resource or skill set around, for example, the creation of these types of applications, you can pretty much guarantee that between the contacts at one organization, that the contacts at the other are going to have the same base underlying structure related to it, because the common data model is there to help us define what should be in a customer table, what should be in, for example, a contact or the account table or any other table that's part of that common data model set. The other aspect here that's really important is the fact that these tools work very seamlessly together, and this is a big shift comparatively from where we were in the past. For example, I can create a Power App. That Power App, let's pick on it and say it's a Canvas-driven app. I can actually embed that, for example, inside of a Power BI report, or I can have that Power App as well embedded inside of finance and operations as an app inside of the application, or I could embed it in Teams. So these different tools are really focused on, from a Microsoft perspective, to make sure that they work seamlessly together. Now, the key thing here as well is that all this goodness comes at a substantially reduced cost for the development process, because you're involving different types of resources that are at different levels of pay, as you can imagine, just getting straight to the point. The other aspect of it as well is the fact that you actually have a focus now on not the plumbing, so to speak, of the application, but of the visualization of the application. That plumbing component takes a lot of work, to be quite candid. If you've ever even developed a more modern high code type environment using, for example, model view models or MVM concepts with ASP.NET, you know how much code is needed, and that's why there are control companies like Telerik and others that then publish controls that you can embed, because they take a lot of that work out of the way from those technicalities. Just to be really candid with it, most people don't want to focus on a grid control and whether or not, if you click on it, it shows a little box around that box that you click on or not. That's typically a control, which is a much deeper type of conversation, obviously. The cool thing about this, though, with the Power Platform is that it does support both, though. You can do this by then using the PCF components, for example, to add your own custom controls then inside of the Power Platform. And then finally here, it allows us to really deploy this to multiple targets. And this is a really important concept just to kind of think through in the long term, meaning, I don't know about you, but I use my phone for a lot of my interaction inside of business systems. And a lot of people, when they're doing field service, for example, or if they're actually going through and trying to capture data or screenshots of things that they need, for example, with asset management and repairs, phones and different types of devices or compute devices are needed to be able to really drive, obviously, some of those business system optimizations that you're looking for and the data that you need to make really good decisions. So the cool thing about the Power Platform is it's designed to actually work with multiple targets, which means phones, PCs, desktops, you name it. It can use those, and I anticipate that to be even further used in the future, as you can assume. So one of the things I want to get ahead of really quickly here, though, as well, is that I will say that there are some out there that have some negativity towards the Power Platform, and I just want to be candid with all of you. I do think that there is some validity to this, right? But I think it's all in the lens of the person that's using the tool to drive, obviously, the business need for it. So some of the negativity you're going to hear is obviously it's a very polarizing concept for people that have been in an industry for a very long period of time. I'm going to pick on me as a developer, where I'm so used to high code and all this capability that I can do as part of it and all these options that I can do with my methods to basically create very specific and targeted code, because I also understand the architecture around that as well, as you can imagine. And when we introduce others into the conversation that may not be as technical as, for example, a developer or an architect, there is obviously potentially some slowdown that occurs, even compared to then what you would do from a high code environment where you can theoretically increase the cost because of the people transition and conversation that needs to occur with it. So introducing these new resources obviously can cause that polarization. The other aspect of this, to be quite candid, is that there's a lot of people that tout it as the best platform that you'll ever have. It's the only thing you'll ever need. And what I want to relate to people is that I've gone through personally 3 different platforms that I developed on for business systems, with the Navision product that became Nav and then BC, with finance and operations, for example, and the code that's needed then to be able to drive, for example, some of the pages that we interact with as well. And then finally, as well, on the Power Platform, as I've been building model-driven apps and Canvas apps quite substantially as we go through our demonstration life cycles. But the thing I've noted about all of them is that all of them can do the same exact thing, but all of them do it a little bit differently, is what it really boils down to. In BC, we have, for example, the same concept as model-driven apps, where you can build, for example, a page inside of Business Central, and it's basically designed where you can't put exactly where you want that field to be, because it's a layout basically for how BC pages work as part of that. Same thing on the model-driven apps, but there's a little bit of a different lens that you go through to tackle it. I guess the big thing here is just remember, when you start talking about the Power Platform, you need to consider, for example, the supportability of the application longer term in the resource alignment that you have internally in your organization. The other thing to note as well is that this is a platform that is not designed to be a consumer facing application stack. What do I mean by that? You're not typically going to the Play Store or App Store to build applications on the Power Platform that you then publish to those. Now, I know we can do that. I know that there is the ability, for example, to basically create those applications and publish them. We've seen those as some of the new features around it. But this also comes into play when it comes to licensing, because now there's a whole different perspective here compared to where you were in the past, where, for example, if I actually take an application and design it inside of a high code environment, typically, if I then publish that application, for example, to a phone, I don't have any licensing or any of that that needs to be a part of it, right? So just remember that this is really designed around business systems, around internal organizations, or what we would call in the past really line of business-based applications that we interact with. As long as you understand these, there's easy ways to get through all of them. Number one, have better training for end users. Number two, have it where your solution architects and developers are helping people understand concepts, so that after your first couple applications you develop, you've got better alignment towards it. Focus on what you're going to need from a licensing perspective by involving a partner that will tell you what you're going to need to be able to do it. But remember, just don't believe in the negativity. Try to figure out like what is really the negativity that's related to it as you go through that. Now, once you've gotten through that, the question is, should you use it? And I will say, just bluntly, yes. Like, there's not a doubt in my mind. I mean, I think that most businesses are at a substantial disadvantage by not using the Power Platform because of how quickly it can design and develop applications and how easy it is. I will tell you, as a developer, I absolutely love the fact that I do not need to worry about control lines of code that build that control and display it or hide it. Instead, I've got some properties or some formulas that I can set up very quickly, and it will react exactly the way I want it to. I don't have to worry about the transport between the application and the backend for Dataverse because it's managing that through those connections that are inside of the application. So there's just a lot of goodness that comes out of this that can help you then really address those needs. And like I said, I think you should absolutely use it as you go through it. Now, when we start with this, what do you start with, right? Because when you look at the Power Platform, and really what we're going to change our focus around really here is going to be around Power Apps. Where do you start this conversation, right? Because it's like, well, okay, I can do anything on it. I can build anything. It's super easy. Everyone touts it as something that's easy. How do I start, right? The key thing to note with this is that software development lifecycles, SDLCs, are something that still applies to the Power Platform. It would be very inappropriate for you to basically not take a lot of these processes from the planning perspective, from the deployment perspective, from the testing perspective, and say we don't need to do any of that anymore because we can just build an app really rapidly and release it. That's not the right way to look at this. Instead, look at it as you have your process to go through the planning, the design, the development, the testing, and the deployment. And really, of that, you're shortening the development perspective here typically inside of these deployment scenarios that you have. And you may be making it easier for testing, for example, or faster for testing because there's more resources you can access, and maybe as well on the planning side because you now have a defined conformed set of what you can do inside of the application. You may reduce that as well because we all know in these high code environments when building, for example, a C# application, the sky's the limit, whereas in the Power Platform, technically the sky's the limit, but the best practices focus around the reusability, obviously, of code and controls that are inside of these particular platforms. So you always still want to start with planning. And what I always recommend is start looking at it through the lens of planning through data, right? So first off, you have to identify the business process need. Don't go and introduce the Power Platform just because it looks cool or just because you think you can take that technology and then apply it basically to your business environment. I will say from personal experience, I had a lot of those that I've sold in the past. I've had, for example, Target Business Analytics back in the day where we would spin the globe and it was graphical, 3D, and everyone loved it. But all it did is spun the globe. It didn't really do anything beyond that, but it was such a cool feature that everyone wanted it. So the point of that is that usually when we implemented that, we had misalignment from what the business need was. So make sure that is the very first conversation that you have. What is the business need? And then from the business need, can we tackle this with the Power Platform? Or do we need some other technology to be able to address that? And when you do that, what you want to do after you've actually identified the business need is say, well, what are we trying to capture? What's the input to this business process and what's the output of this business process, right? It's very, very rudimentary, right? But it's something that many people don't think about. They think about the technology to address it, or they think about the process, but they don't think about what data they need to capture as they go through that process. So, what does the end user need to be able to enter? Are there things that you need to automate through this entry? What kind of data is needed? Do you need decimals, text boxes, or text data, integer-based values, right? And these are concepts that you're going to have to learn no matter what to go through basically the design paradigm that is in there, right? So that's a really important aspect here is that you're thinking through then obviously that data perspective as well. And then what you want to do obviously is walk through these steps that you think are needed as well to basically take that business process and reflect in the business process what the data state is going to be as you go through that process. So obviously you've documented the business process, you're aligning maybe groups of users that are going to be using it. An example would be if a purchase order, let's say you are designing some type of purchase order system in Dataverse for some reason, well, you probably want to have it where a purchase order has a state of released, where someone wants to examine those to then call the vendor to say, we need to order this. And then once they have that, they probably want to move it from a release status to confirmed, right? Which means that the vendor did do something with it, which may involve a different team member that is going to be then managing that potentially. So you need to think about buckets and stages of data as it's going along to be able to support that. And then finally, you need to understand what that output is going to be. What are you doing with this process? Is the process there just to be a process? Well, that's probably a red flag, right? You should probably re-examine that then. But is that data needed then for something else inside of your environment? Is that needed for reporting? Is that needed to basically manage the process where you can have a lower cost individual that can come in to play that role? Or maybe you want to increase the scale so you don't lower the cost or the ability, but you increase the scale of the existing resource to do more with it, which entirely does kind of reduce the cost of it, right, as part of the output of it. So the point here is that you need to really be cognizant of these at the very front end of your process. Don't go through the technology alignment with it and then from there do the next steps with it. Now, once you understand the data, the question is, how do you want it to look, right? And this also is something that you need to consider as you go through this process. So as you can imagine, you've got this process, you kind of know what you're going to be capturing, you understand what the inputs are, hopefully you've kind of figured out, hey, when I do this, I need these status changes because it's going to inform these people, because really at this stage, we're not doing the technology, but we have to do some of the pseudo technology to do the alignment to the end users. And like I said, I always focus on the end user experience as the paramount mark in this conversation. And the reason I do that is because, I'll just give a quick example, MRP and MPS. Everyone always says that they want MRP. Every single person that I've ever gone through with a manufacturing implementation is like, yeah, we absolutely want to use MRP. And then they realize the data maintenance requirement that is there and how much time that takes for resources to be able to do that. So the point here is that you want to make sure that even though it's aspirational, for example, to get to MRP or MPS for a lot of organizations, maybe you should be thinking about what's the end user impact with it? Because if an end user is frustrated with it, they're going to say the system is wrong, right? We've all been there. And then from there, what's going to happen is you're going to get low adoption. You're going to have more business process challenges. And obviously, you just haven't done a good job at the change management perspective then to introduce those types of changes. So just note that you should be focusing on that end user experience as the very first thing inside of your development methodology. Now, beyond that, then, what you have to do eventually is figure out, well, how do I want to display that data, right? Is this data that's in a row format? Is it like on a card that I can put this into and punch it in, for example? Does it need to be on different devices? Do I need automation involved with it? Do I need to make certain fields required and others optional? Or are some of them conditional where I have to populate this field if that other field is used? And or do I need to do embedding? Do I need to take this and actually put it in a Power BI report because I want to reuse it, or in Teams or some other area of your environment, right? So what you need to understand that is then what is that going to be in terms of what that look is, right? And so for us, what we typically look at then with that is identifying then the two different types of apps then that would be used potentially to visualize, obviously, these different types of business process requirements, right? So at a high level, remember, Power Apps have really two primary different types of apps that you can design. And I want to demystify this quickly because it's really important to understand as we look at this inside of, obviously, the Dynamics 365 environment and also even in the Power Platform for that matter. So first off, Canvas apps. That is one of the very first ones that we started to see, to be quite candid. Model-driven apps were there as well, but Canvas apps got a lot of traction beyond then what we would classify as the old classical CRM-based applications, because it is more of that what you see is what you get type of design methodology that you can do on a form. So, as an example, if you are designing an application and you need to have very granular control over what the user experience or what they're visualizing or seeing inside of the application, well, a Canvas app is generally a better tool to be able to do that. You can add shapes, you can add text boxes, you can make a text box bigger or bold. You can, dare I say, add colors to anything that you want very easily and quickly. You can create custom controls through the PCF framework, and you can do that as well with model-driven apps. But the point here is that with Canvas apps, it's more of that canvas, right, where you can build, connect, and then use galleries, controls, and different map controls, for example, to quickly build an application, but you still have full control over that canvas, so to speak. So a lot of these were used typically for example, phone and tablet-based apps, which is good and bad, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But for example, if you need to make a button bigger because the people that are interacting with it have gloves on, and those gloves may have, fingerprint or touch sensor type capabilities to them as well, well, you may have to make a button bigger than what a model-driven app does, right? Because a model-driven app has a defined size and style that's typically applied to it for consistency with it. So, like I said, Canvas apps are typically used more often in phone and tablet apps. But I will say, with the responsive layout concepts that are there, and that is the term that we use in Canvas apps, it's called responsive layout. If you ever want to look it up to be able to understand how you can take a Canvas app and make it scale then to a tablet, to a phone, or to a PC, we use the responsive layout methodologies to tackle that. But it is a design methodology that you have to think about. When you do a Canvas app, typically you get to select you want a tablet app or a PC, or a tablet app or a phone app, as part of that deployment process or creation process. Net result here is that if you want something that's going to be shared across phones, tablets, and PCs, you need to understand that as well as you go through this. So when you design your Canvas app, you don't have a lot of rework that's needed for it. Now, on the other end of this is the model-driven apps, right? These things are quick for creation. I want to take, for example, and drop, boom, put in a control, not a control, but a field, a value that is going to be on this page. And this page is an info page, or this page is a detail page, or this page is a grid page, right? Or a list or a view, for example. But I don't have the ability to tell the system where I want that field to be very specifically. Maybe able to define the order of it and maybe a grouping of it, but I can't say go to the very bottom right here and leave all this white space inside of the app and make that button 5 times bigger. That's not the concept behind model-driven apps. If you've ever used LightSwitch, it's more akin to LightSwitch. You can go ahead and design, obviously, the layout, the format. You can do things like, the column layouts, 1, 2, 3, like you have in web design as well. But they're really designed to allow you to rapidly create a card type page and a list type page that you interact with for data. Examples of model-driven apps: all the Dynamics 365 applications, sales, customer service, you name it. Those are model-driven apps that we use inside of the environment to drive that. That is where you've got a list, you've got a menu on the far right. You click on that, it shows you a list of records. You click on that record, it shows you a detail record with it, right? So both of them have the ability then as well to be on different devices. The nice thing about the model-driven apps is because they are not something that is a canvas, what Microsoft has done is they have a front end that allows us then to take and develop, for example, the model-driven app, and then from there, those forms and views and screens can be very easily displayed and scaled properly to a phone or a tablet or a PC without any additional work as well. But remember, you can't control the layout as easily as you can with the Canvas app, right? So let's take a quick look at this, because I think it makes more sense to talk through it a little bit more as we go through this to really understand. So I'm going to go here, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to make.powerapps.com, And I'm going to go ahead and I'll probably have to sign in with my pre-sales tenant here. Thank you, Bobby. I just want to give a shout out to Bobby. The setup for getting our pre-sales tenant has been lots and lots of fun. But what I want to do here is I'm going to go into, let's do our finance environment that we have inside of here. Now, when I click on apps over here and click on these apps as an example, this is where then we can see all the different types of applications that we have set up then inside of this environment. So for example, on the far right here, these are model-driven apps that I can interact with. So like, for example, portal management. And if I press play on it to actually open up that portal and then go ahead and log in, what we're going to see then here, after I get my authentication for this, let me just do this and this. Let's try it again. There we go. Of course, you guys can see the multi-factor authentication because I think that that's always really cool that that's a native capability. But let's go ahead and log in here and do all of my fingerprints and that kind of stuff to verify that it's me. And boom, we're going to see now, obviously, a model-driven app that's going to pop up here as we go through this process. So here, as we kind of let it load just in the background, is the concept of a model-driven app, right? I've got my navigation on the far left here that I can interact with. And I may also have dashboards. So like if we look at Dynamics 365 Sales, for example, typically you're joining a dashboard as you go through that process. I have a list of records or a view, and I can actually change these views pretty easily, right? Or I can create new views. And as part of the development process, you can actually create your own views, which are the categories or buckets that I talked about. If I click on, for example, a record inside of here, it brings me to a more detailed page where, as you can see, this layout is very consistent, where the different tabs that I access to get to that information is visible inside of here. Whereas as well, then I have fields that I can plop into here, but this is actually in a 2-column format, as you can tell, and it's always going to conform then to that consistent experience, right? So this is a really good thing to note then when we start looking at, obviously, the model-driven apps, is that they provide this very consistent experience, so that way you can rapidly create applications that the organization can use that are very consistent in nature, as you can imagine. Now, we can go beyond that, though, too. So Canvas-driven apps are another one that's inside of here. And I'm just going to open up this Canvas-driven app just to kind of show you. Now, this app is actually the new expense management type capability that we have, or excuse me, the EAM capability, where I can do, for example, maintenance requests that are inside of here. So this is using, as you can see as well, a fairly responsive layout. But really what it's designed to do, if I pull it out, is that you're supposed to actually go through and pretend I'm on a phone, right? Or a tablet, or some other device that I'm using to basically go through and do some of these different types of transactions. So as you can see here, this is substantially different in look and feel compared to, like we've seen before, the other model-driven apps that are inside of the system. And it's allowing me to obviously then interact with additional data. So work orders, for example, are inside of here so I can interact with them. I can click on, for example, my action to create a new request for maintenance, for example. I can search for assets if I actually have it set up to basically access them. So like for a forklift as an example, I can put information inside of here. So all these controls that you're looking at, this is a what you see is what you get designer. And just to kind of compare that, so if I come over here now, and let's say we want to edit this Canvas-driven app inside of the environment by clicking on the edit button, basically what we're going to see here then is a designer that allows me now to go through and make many of these different types of changes then to the application to be able to extend it. So if we start with the Canvas app to really drive this conversation home, basically what we can see here as we go through this is the fact that I can actually go through these different screens and then I can plop different controls on it to be able to tackle some of these requirements. So my work order screen, right? It's right there. That's what a work order looks like. Let's say I don't like that red. It's giving me blood pressure, or there's some value here I don't want. Well, what I can do is I can actually go to the different properties that are inside of here and then make those changes. And one of the things to note here is that it's not code, but there are different types of formulas that you can do using PowerFX, which are very similar then to what you would use, for example, inside of Excel. And basically what happens here is that based upon when you press on it, or if you select it, or if you do a particular action, it's going to then change, for example, that color or that style, or take an action off of it to be able to drive that. If I want to make, for example, this no longer blue, I could come into my properties here and I could say my app, you know what, I take it back. I want it to be more red, for example, for my fill. So I can come in here, change that, change the fill that's related to it, and then boom, you're going to have different types of colors that you're going to have. If I want to insert, for example, a map or a gallery or some other control that's inside of here, I can easily do that then by basically going through and then selecting what that would be. If we pick on, for example, AI Builder, I could have, for example, a business card reader that I could actually embed inside of here that I could then configure and then do code or PowerFX formulas to basically scan then a business card as an example. So this is just one aspect to consider. And if we consider, for example, the model-driven apps with it, I won't save this, we'll close it away. Model-driven apps look a little bit different, right? So when I create the editing experience around this, I start really at a navigation pane to do this. I have forms that I interact with, and on these forms, if I want to modify them, what I would do is I would click on the edit action, and the designing experience is going to be a little bit different now, right? Because basically, I have a format that I follow with this, so that if I want to add a new field into here, I can't say put the created by Ray over in the top right here, right? When I add it, for example, it may work there for that one, but if we try to do, for example, modified, and I want it to be maybe in the bottom right corner or something like that on this screen, it's not going to allow me basically to do that. So as you can see here, even though I was in the far right here, this is a single pane that is actually being displayed in terms of what this control is as a tab. Actually, it is two column, it looks like, but the column format here then defines what that layout is going to be represented then on the screen for you to interact with. So this is just a really important concept to note the difference with them, because it really does help you align then the applications and the usage of them. If it's a phone app or tablet app, more than likely, you're probably going to want to look at Canvas apps. But let's say it's a salesperson that wants to track leads and opportunities. Well, does it really make sense to not take our lead and opportunity that might be in Dynamics 365 Sales and create a whole new Canvas-driven app when you could just take that model-driven app and then expose it on the phone as a model-driven app instead? Those are other decisions that you need to kind of think through as you go through your process and through your identification, obviously, as part of that process. So hopefully it kind of helps just kind of understand a little bit more of that, but that's really where those differentiators are. Now, once you've identified the type of app, what you want to do is obviously use what we call solutions. And I'm going to take this out so you can see kind of the statement around this as well. So obviously, when you're developing a production-centric application, you want to use what we call solutions inside of Dataverse to group together all these different assets that you may be creating. And it's a really simple concept. It's basically, instead of going and saying new app, which it's great that they have it, instead, what you can do is you go to solutions, you build a new solution, and you call this my new application, right? Or something of that nature. And what a solution allows me to do as I build this out, we'll say it's my default publisher. I always start with my version 1 for alphas that are inside of here. Boom, now what I can do is I can actually go through and then add different types of things on the Power Platform that I would use to basically then, as you can imagine, address those business needs. So as an example, I could click on New App, and I could create a new Canvas app inside of here. And I could specify this is my new app and say it's a tablet app, right, as part of this. So it's really nice to be able to then group this together, because then what you can do is you can export these solutions, and you can use things like source control and version control with it. As an example, when I do my development for these, what I typically do is I actually create the solution, and then from there, as I'm doing development, I'll export the solution because there's an export option for it. And then the file that it provides is a little zip file. You can basically expand that and then save it to, for example, GitHub. So that way then you can have change control, that you're tracking all these different changes. And if you use Azure DevOps, you can do pipelining and some more advanced concepts to basically incorporate that. But using a solution groups all of this together, and I highly recommend it, because you don't want to typically be trying to move, for example, an app individually from all the other resources. Because, for example, you may need a new table, or you may need, for example, some type of rule that's related to it, or a dashboard that you want to add, for example, into here. So these different types of features on the Power Platform and capabilities allow for you to really rapidly then incorporate those and then move those between your dev, test, and production life cycles, as you can imagine as well. Now, mind you, you can add existing as well, right? So like, let's say you did do it the opposite way, which is possible, right? And maybe the reason you want to do that is because when you click on the new app, you can start with Copilot as an example, and you could say, for example, I want to create an asset management application that keeps track of all of my assets and has the commonly needed fields to track insurance, warranty, and life time of that asset, right? So cool thing about Copilot too as well for you, you can start using this more and more to really identify, for example, then how a table should look like, or what you should be able to add to that table. So here's an example using Copilot where I've got asset IDs, I've got asset names, I've got the dates I purchased it, I've got my insurance end date or expiry date, warranty expiry date that's on here, I've got my lifetime in years that I'm keeping track of, and then I have a status that's here, right? And you can use this, for example, add another text field that allows me to write a book about that asset, right? Or something like that, right? So the cool thing about Copilot is that it allows you then to see what it would do to be able to address that particular need. And you can even then see, for example, the different types of data types that are there to see, is it a single line of text or not? And then you could say, for example, update the book description to a multi-line text, right? And so some of these work and some of them don't, mind you. I'm still learning what prompting is available, for example. But the cool thing about this is that it allows you then to basically tackle some of those different types of scenarios that you may need. And even though it says it updated, it didn't look like it refreshed it as well, right? So as you can see, we're going to get more and more of this as time goes on as well. So other areas then, just to kind of mention here then as part of this, obviously, is that if you create, for example, that app then off of that table, so we've got that table that's inside of here, and I click on that create app, well, I've bypassed the solution, right? Well, once again, what you can do, create the app if you have to, and then go back, for example, then to the actual solution, and then add existing into there so that you group all of your requirements together as you go through that process. Now, one final note here too on this. Remember, right now in this that I'm showing here, we're using Dataverse. That table that was created inside of Dataverse as we went through that process. Now, mind you, you don't need to use Dataverse for all Canvas-driven apps. So as an example, I can create a Canvas app. I can create a solution still in Dataverse. I can add that app then into that solution, but I can create a connection to an Azure SQL database, or a connection to, for example, another area as well. For example, Business Central, I've had a lot that I've created that actually accesses the web services, or even the web services inside of F&O without using the native connector, to be able to then get to that information inside of the system. So some of the things here, Clyde was asking, it figured out from the context to add the asset status. Yes, it did. The cool thing about it is that it looks at a repository in the large language model to identify application development and some of those concepts that are around asset management, and then adds those necessary fields then to it for a status in that situation. And then Rob had one, create a one-to-many relationship between two tables. Not sure if that's supported, but they're adding more and more every single day to make that experience easier. The reason I show it is that if you have a question about something, it makes it a little bit easier then to basically create that app or understand what you would do in that situation to create it. And eventually we get to this. Like, look at this. Like, I just created a quick asset management app that it's not as deep, obviously, as field service or EAM inside of F&O or even the asset guardian inside of BC. But if I just need to basically track some asset information, there you go, right? So this can help you with that organization of data. Now, mind you, be careful. Too much of something is not always a good thing, right? So you've got to make sure you really balance that as you go through that process. Now, the other thing I just want to kind of highlight here too as well is that when you're going through this process to develop these applications, don't look at it as something that you're just going to be doing inside of the application and documenting with it. You want to start documenting really early as you go through this process, right? So as you can see here, obviously as through the documentation process, we should have started that at the very beginning of this, right? Meaning as you're going through the planning steps, you're identifying the fields. You should be saying what the type of fields are and what the data is with it, because what you need to eventually do is communicate this information back to end users, right? So you're going to want to, for example, start the documentation process at the very beginning. You're going to want to understand what the business process is, and that should be the very first paragraph inside of any design documentation as to why the business process need is there and what it's trying to accomplish. Is it helping our customers? Is it helping us be more efficient? Is it catching things? For example, do we need to Power Automate so that when a book gets submitted for review, and my wife just ran into this recently, she had an audiobook that she published for review, and they moved to a new system, and they're supposed to basically take an audiobook and certify it in 10 days. Well, it's been 15 days and nothing has happened. Well, shouldn't there be an automate or a process in place that catches that at 10 days and says, hey, this is a critical issue. We said 10 days for our SLA and we're not accomplishing it. Well, we should use a Power Automate to address that. So these app designs don't have to be documents or requirements that are just around an application. You can use it for other scenarios such as automation as well as part of that process. I like to do mock-ups as well. So Figma is a tool I've used in the past. You can also just use Power Apps. Like if you're building it out and you want to take screenshots of the app but not have the plumbing that's in place, so to speak, for really like optional fields, required fields, and things of that nature, you could use basically the Maker portal to do that as well. But the result of all of this is make sure you document this so that the end user can also understand this as well. And that's the one, I would say, cardinal sin that I think a lot of development teams make as they go through this process. They don't involve the end user, even through the documentation stages here. Involve the people that are going to be interacting with the system early and often, obviously, as you go through this process. Now, one thing to note here, too, is that we've looked at the Power Apps. The other thing we need to really look at is what do we do to really make sure that we have an app that's actually impactful, whether it's a Canvas app or a model-driven app. And my statement around this is build iteratively and often. And what I mean by that, we've all experienced it. A lot of people, the biggest mistake I've ever seen in the industry, and in my youth, I was young one time, we actually had some fun where we would go and talk to the customer and then go back into our room and code something up. And I'd say 60, 70% of the time we nailed it or even got better than nailed it. But the 30% of the time was not a fun experience, because what happened is that we would design something, for example, not get customer input, build things on top of that as well, and then all of a sudden we have this Frankenstein monster from the customer or end user's perspective that does not accomplish the goals that they thought were going to be accomplished as part of that application, right? So something to note here is that remember that you're always going to want to focus on obviously involving these end users. And the thing to note is that no designer is ever going to be perfect. So what we want to do is we want to incorporate those views and those perspectives to really help align the reality to that, and to basically ensure that we can test as well different components as we're introducing them through even our development process, right? The final thing here to note is that you definitely want to use some of that source control as well as you go through this process. If you're going to build a model-driven app and you want to track the changes to show the progress that you've done, or if you've made a change and you don't know why all of a sudden there's a bug that's happening from an end user perspective, usually you go back to the list of changes that recently happened that you then roll back or examine to figure out what that impact is going to be. So the point here, when you're building these applications, build them iteratively, build them in basically a serial fashion where you can then involve end users to verify and validate that the assumptions that you've made are correct. And I can guarantee as you get deeper into the Power Platform and into the development methodologies that you're going to basically get better alignment around that. And it can be as super easy as this for source control. And I just want to highlight this because a lot of people are like, oh, I got to go and do X, Y, and Z and A, B, and C. Well, let's take this one as an example. Let's save this. So this is our asset management app that we created inside of here. Let's go back to our make.powerapps.com. And then what I'm going to do is just show you that when it comes to, for example, a solution that's inside of here, so it did save away. When it comes to our solutions that are inside of here, we can highlight, for the example, these solutions, and then we can export the solution as part of that. And what we can do is we could, for example, for moving it to another environment, we can save it as a managed or unmanaged. So if we're going to a test or production, typically we're going to do managed. We're not going to get into the details of that at this point. Just note that if you're going to test and prod, typically you're doing managed solutions, and unmanaged are usually for the development process. But what you can do then is you can export this and then download that file that it creates and really create a very basic type of source control by then having Git, uploading it to GitHub, for example, and at least then you've got some ability to go back to different versions of the product to be able to see what those changes are as you go through that. So it does provide, as you can imagine here, then some of that version control capability that you can use to really manage that as well. It doesn't have to be fancy, it just has to work. And as an end user, you're probably not going to be big into DevOps. You're probably not going to be big into pipelining and things of that nature that are great for really bigger Power Platform applications. But mind you, I want more people to use the Power Platform. I want more end users to use it because, quite candidly, I just love the ideas and concepts and even some of the visualization that comes from different people looking at it differently through their lens of the world. It's just a really exciting thing to kind of see. Now, the other thing to note here as well is that when we go through this, remember with the Power App, you don't want to do everything inside of one environment. So as you can see here on our environments, if I go back to my home inside of here, I have multiple environments that we have inside of the Power Platform here. And so this is a pre-sales tenant. So we've got sales, customer service, sales field service, sales finance, sales marketing, BC. What these are then are separate environments then that we can then test and validate code. At a minimum, I'm going to say a minimum, dev and prod, right? I would argue very strongly that dev, test, prod should be there, right? People will say, can you get away with dev and prod? You can if you're a really, really small shop. If you're above 5 users, though, I'm going to say test is a really handy tool because what you're doing from dev is you're exporting it typically as a managed solution to test. And what you want to do is you want to basically take what you exported from your development environment, that file that's generated, that export solution when we do it, that's what we want to upload to test in production. We don't want to go into test and make changes in test and then move that code to production. We want to always start at the bottom, start from dev, go to test, go to prod, and iterate through that. And what that means then is that we're going to have some scenarios where, for example, we're going to have version differences between them. As an example with this, when you're creating a testing package with it and you bring it to the test environment, let's say it fails testing from an end user perspective. Well, I don't want to take that solution and move it to production and then take another solution and move it to production. What I want to do is I want to go back into my development environment, make the changes that are needed, increment the version, push that to test, that file, and then if that passes, that same exact file is what I want to push into production as part of that process. So this is a different concept that you need to think through, because what happens is you will notice that some builds get dead-ended at test. And that is a very valid approach. Even the Windows team, when it comes to, for example, the Windows builds that we see, do the exact same thing, where insider builds don't all make it, as you can imagine, to production or release preview builds. Certain build numbers are promoted as they go through that process. So just make sure you're keeping track of these versions. Create an Excel file. Create a Power App where you can actually go through and then maintain those versions and where they are and where they've been certified or not certified as they go through that. And don't be afraid of version skipping between test to production, for example, and don't try to do incremental. It's really hard to do that. And obviously, now you've got to import, instead of one file, you've got to import 5 or 6 or 7 different files to get to the same output. It's just not typically necessary to do that as part of the process. Now, I know we're getting at time here, and I just want to make sure to wrap this up really quickly. I've got 2 more slides for this. The final thing here, obviously, with your Power Apps, test, 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 and test again. Make sure you incorporate what we call unit testing. So as you're doing your development, make sure that the format of the field looks right, that the data type is right, that if it has to update another field, it's doing that. This is the most granular level of testing, and it's typically done by whoever is creating the Power App. Make sure then as well that once you move it to test, that as a developer, you test the process as well. Don't let the end user test it. I can't tell you how many times I've had it where I've had someone in some area that's made a bunch of changes, pushes it to test, and the end user clicks on the very first thing and it crashes. It's like, we need to test the process as well. So make sure you test that before you go into what we call user acceptance testing, which is the end user testing then where they certify it as part of that process. And make sure as well that that user acceptance testing is owned by the user. Now, as part of your documentation process, you probably should have gotten test cases because you're trying to align the business need to what you're trying to accomplish. How are you going to test what you're trying to accomplish? Well, you have end users create test cases, and then they try those then in the application to do that. And then finally, if you're doing a very large rollout, obviously, you want to think about, obviously, like load testing. And I don't mean load testing like we're going to bring Dataverse down. That would be pretty substantial, and that would be pretty incredible. What would really be important here would be the fact that if you've got multiple users that are interacting with that same type of data, are there scenarios that happen where if an end user updates this, that it causes a problem with this end user? We want to identify those, obviously, before we go live as we do that process. And finally, we'll do it live, right? When you go live, the testing process is there to help you reduce the risks of the known, right? The unknown is what will destroy your application or your business system rollout very quickly. And it's not just the unknown, it's the scale of the unknown, right? So if you haven't done testing and validation around it from a unit testing, process testing, conference room pilot / joint testing as part of that, you haven't reduced that risk, because now when we go live, I may be focusing on those things that I could have done, and I can guarantee to you that you're going to have a problem that you didn't think about. What do you want to focus on at go live? Do you want to focus on the things you should have done up front, or do you want to focus on, for example, maybe the things that'll pop up that are going to risk it, but you're going to try to enable around that, right? So the big thing here is that make sure you go through those testing processes to make sure your application is ready. And finally, don't try to make changes in production if possible. Now, mind you, I understand, and I think anybody understands as well, real world wise, sometimes the same data that's in production isn't in test or isn't in dev. you basically probably should, before you go live, try to make maybe a sandbox environment that's a copy of production as you've gone live, so you can actually recreate those scenarios in a sandbox environment for it, right? So, but if you have to, obviously, you may need to make some changes in production. Just be very, very, very careful with that, because especially when you're dealing with managed solutions, and especially when you're doing, for example, with the backporting of it, you've got to be very cautious of what you're going to do for changes, because you would actually create different versions now of the product that you're trying to create. And then make sure as well that you really define what I call a clear chain of command. My dad was command sergeant major, 27 years, something of that nature. Not big into military chain of command, so to speak, but it does make it a lot easier to understand, if I'm an end user, who do I go to first? Do I call Stone Ridge right away? Probably not. Probably talk to my manager. My manager probably includes the subject matter expert that was the person that did the test cases and verified and validated that the business system was working. And then from there, if they can't fix it, they're probably then going to get either our internal design resources, which may be a PM, maybe a developer, it all depends on your structure, or maybe an external one as well, or external party, such as Stone Ridge, that may be doing that. And then finally, be on the ground. I can't stress this enough. Be in the trenches. Be a leader with this. We used to, way back in the day, we had walkie-talkies that we'd have on us that we would run around when we did a deployment. So that way we had a central command center that then, as issues came in, we would actually then take them. We may have had a developer walk out to the floor, for example, to address things. But it made it so much easier to really identify and work with the team to figure out what's going on. And end users really appreciate that, as well, as you can imagine, because obviously they feel you're a part of really trying to accomplish something together, which is really ideally making their jobs easier or more satisfactory, right, when they're going through their business process. That's why we use technology to augment a lot of these capabilities inside of an environment. But just make sure you think through then, as you introduce this Power App, how are you going to be in there? How are you going to help with that? What are you going to do when there is an issue? Who are you going to go talk to? And I always go right to the end user, because they're the ones that are using it. They're the ones I'm hoping are going to identify what's broken with it. And I'm not going to be too proud to say, oops, I made a mistake, or oops, that didn't work. Let me help you fix it. I'm going to help you fix it, right? That's the culture and mentality that you need to get to be really successful. And we can argue, obviously, that that's not just Power App centric. That's with any application development methodology as well. So all that being said, that's kind of it that I had today that I wanted to go through with it. I'm going to go ahead and flip back over to my Just Chatting inside of here. So first and foremost, thank you for joining Stone Ridge Confab. Hopefully this was informational for you. Obviously, we've got a lot of experience in Power Apps and the development methodologies that you should be considering, how you should deploy those. We'd love to talk to you more about it as we go through this, right? So feel free to go ahead and ping us as needed and reach out to us. A big thing I want to announce is that on March 7th, so 2 weeks from now, we are going to be going over the release notes for the Dynamics 365 products, which is a pretty fun time, to be honest. So I know a lot of others are already front and center. They've gone onto YouTube and published it all. We like to approach it from what we feel are going to be very impactful for our clients, because we can't talk about all the different technologies, obviously, in that short amount of time. So please feel free to join us for that. Ask questions as you go through it. I saw some great ones on here as well. Sam, appreciate the insightful presentation. I really appreciate that. Rob, like you said, rapid application development, it absolutely is, right. And obviously, I really like what Clyde said. If you have an end user that knows how to break applications, they're the best end user to interact with, because they take a lot of the risk out when we go live. We just have to understand that as a developer or as a maker, if you're a citizen dev that are going into it, it's not that your application was bad, it's that it's learning, or it's something that happened that wasn't just identified or understood. That's the nature of software development. So don't be ever ashamed if you actually have an end user that breaks it. I will say, I don't know if Becky Inman is ever on these confabs, but her and her husband, Daryl, Becky was amazing at breaking anything I made, and I absolutely adored her capabilities and what she brought to the table because it made our applications better as we went through that process. So, that being said, thank you all for joining. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll talk to you regarding the Wave release coming up for the 2024 products. Thank you much.